All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our next session of the day. We're going to be talking about authoritarianism and why it is bad for public health. Alex Gladstein is here joining us today. Thanks for being here, man. He's the Chief Strategy Officer at the Human Rights Foundation. He has also served as the Vice President of Strategy for the Oslo Freedom Forum since its inception in 2009. In his work, Alex has connected hundreds of dissidents and civil society groups with business leaders, technologists, journalists, philanthropists, policymakers, and artists to promote free and open societies. Alex's writing and views on human rights and technology have appeared in media outlets across the world, including The Atlantic, BBC, CNN, Fast Company, The Guardian, Monocle, Now This, NPR, Quartz, Time, Wired, The New Republic, and The Wall Street Journal. He's spoken at universities ranging from MIT to Stanford, presented at the US State Department and European Parliament, and participated in Singularity University events worldwide. Thank you for joining us. Remember when I read your intro for the first time and I was like, gosh, you have just been everywhere and have been working on some impactful stuff. So thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure. And I think it's very important that we talk about governance and politics in the context of the coronavirus.
Absolutely. And so this session is going to be different from ones that we've done so far where most people have had presentations. Alex and I are just going to have a discussion around how different governments have responded and what we can learn from those responses and some of his observations so far. So I guess let's jump in. What can we learn about the way that China and maybe even a country like Iran have handled the discovery of COVID-19?
Yeah, so what I would like to make the case today is that we don't need a police state to effectively fight, whether it's novel coronavirus or any other kind of public health disaster. When I wrote a piece for Wired magazine a few weeks ago, I was looking at a lot of historical research that institutions like The Economist and others have done over the years, looking at the correlation between openness, the level of human rights and free expression in societies, and their ability to effectively handle pandemics, essentially, epidemics, pandemics, etc. And given a half century of research, the correlation is really strong that democracies handle public health disasters much better than dictatorships. And I think that the underlying reason for that is very similar to what the very well renowned philosopher Amartya Sen uncovered in his work on actually famine and other kind of aspects of public health, but that famine had never really took root in a democracy. And I think the reasons why democracies are at the end of the day better suited than dictatorships to handling public health issues has to do with the idea of openness and free expression and the ability for people to collaborate and innovate without fear. So that being said, obviously there are two kind of axes that I think are relevant for us today. One is openness of a society, right? And the other one is competency, right? So the thing is, you can have a very incompetent democracy, right? So I think that like the United States would be characterized at the moment as a fairly incompetent democracy on this issue. You can also have a very competent closed society. So like Singapore would be a good example of that, right? But long term, and I think what's evident now is that some of the best performing societies right now are open, competent democracies like Korea and Taiwan, right? So I think we can look at that. We can look at some of these extraordinary numbers. Taiwan is a nation of 23 million people, and they sort of first started interacting with this virus in January. Okay, so they've had the thing for 2 months, and they've got, as of Friday, the World Health Organization says that they have 49 cases and 1 death. That's absolutely extraordinary, and they haven't done it. They haven't needed martial law to do it, right? They've done it in a way that elegantly, is in line with their open society and their democracy. At the other end of the spectrum, you have Iran, right? So Iran is like a very incompetent dictatorship. And this is the worst possible situation, right? You have satellite imagery showing people in mass burial pits We have no idea how many have died. Like, certainly thousands and thousands of people have died in Iran from novel coronavirus, but we'll never know the real truth because there is no free press in Iran. Then there's the matter of China, which obviously is like a more competent than Iran, but certainly not as competent as Taiwan or Korea. And they're, they are a dictatorship, obviously, a one-party dictatorship. And a lot of people are essentially basically arguing that China's done a really good job dealing with the novel coronavirus. And I would actually want to disabuse them of that position. My take is the following, which is backed up by an interesting study that came out relatively recently. But basically, like, the reason we have this global pandemic right now is because of Chinese censorship. That is my position. So this disease was first sort of isolated, possibly as early as November, certainly by the end of December by Chinese doctors, right, in Wuhan. And a new research piece that came out a few days ago says that China could have prevented 95% of coronavirus infections if its measures to contain the outbreak had begun 3 weeks earlier. But China only took vigorous action in late January, weeks after police silenced a doctor and other doctors for trying to raise the alarm. So this Wuhan ophthalmologist, Dr. Li Wenliang, he tried to warn about this disease on the 30th of December, but he was punished by the state for spreading rumors. And they basically made him sign a letter that he had made false comments and disturbed the public order. The guy ended up dying of novel coronavirus and has become somewhat of a martyr. But the whole point is that, as you all know here, this disease is exponential and in the way that it is contagious. And had the Chinese government acted on the advice of its good doctors at the end of December, the thing could have been curtailed and contained. They didn't. Instead, they placed the image of the party above the public good, the ultimate bad sacrifice, and they allowed the disease to spread, and they only stepped into action at the end of January when things were getting completely out of control. Right. So I think we need to never lose sight of the fact that this would not be a global pandemic had the Chinese government been a democracy, been an open society that had a free press. So China's totalitarian nature is, I would argue, the key reason we have this global pandemic right now. And I think that's something that people should not forget. Have they changed their tack since? Yes, of course. They've used the full measures and power of the state and done things that are unthinkable in democracies to try and curtail and isolate the virus. And they've been, from what we understand, relatively effective. However, another thing that people need to realize is that you cannot take any data that the Chinese government gives at face value. It all has to be taken with a grain of salt because there are no independent watchdogs in China. There is no free press in China. I mean, the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal are getting thrown out today. Just 2 hours ago, we found out that they're getting thrown out. So, even the Western journalists or, journalists from democracies that are there are being removed. So we're not going to know what's going on there. So at the end of the day, these numbers, that are given to the World Health Organization could easily be fudged, tweaked, fabricated, etc. I'd also like to remind people that the World Health Organization is an enormously political organization. I would argue one of the societies that's handled this virus the best is Taiwan. The World Health Organization doesn't admit that Taiwan is a country. The World Health Organization lists Taiwan as a province of China called Taipei and its environs, if you look at its data. This is embarrassing, pathetic, basically. And it's because the World Health Organization is, bowing down to the Chinese Communist Party. It's really unfortunate. But what ends up happening is that Taiwan and Taiwan's success and the achievements they're having scientifically are being discarded and ignored, which is really, really bad. So here I'm about to give you a piece of data that's going to probably shock a lot of the people on this call. Taiwan was the first country to tell the World Health Organization that coronavirus is transmitting from human to human. The first country, well before China and the World Health Organization admitted it. So we have a structural problem here, much like we do with the United Nations, that the World Health Organization is a political organization. And this is harming our global efforts to contain and address this disease. At the end of the day, the secrecy the lies, the censorship, they only help the virus. So again, my core thesis here is that authoritarianism is bad for public health, that we want more open societies. We want more communication. We want there to be Twitter. We want there to be decentralized responses. We want doctors to be able to innovate and experiment without being arrested, which is not possible in dictatorships like Iran and China.
Yeah, I want to go back to one of the when you're talking about the two axes where you've got openness on the one and then competence on the other. How are you defining competence?
Yeah, I made a little chart, and forgive the fact that it's kind of like
oh, there we go. We see it
just
now.
something I kind of drew up, and it's certainly just as a rhetorical device. This is not scientific. This is very back of the envelope, but it gives you an idea of what I'm thinking about here, about how we have these two axes of openness, like civil liberties, essentially, and competency, right? So I would hope or agree that the sort of most competent governments have been sort of like Singapore, Taiwan, Korea on this matter, even Hong Kong to an extent. And then, I would say the word is out on China. I mean, again, I believe that China is the reason we have the pandemic, but more recently, we would have to admit they've obviously been more competent, right? And then you have countries like the USA and Italy, which, while are more open in structure, are very incompetent. And then at the end of the day, Iran being the least competent and least open. And I would argue that long term for social health, the societies that are furthest up and to the right, the most like Taiwan and Korea, are going to be the ones that handle this the best. And Taiwan is just a shining example of this. I mean, again, folks, 49 cases and 1 death for a country of 23 million that's been dealing with this thing for 2 months. You don't need a police state to fight this virus.
What are some of the measures that Taiwan has taken that maybe other countries can learn from?
Yeah, I mean, look, and here we're going to get into the difference between the people allowing a government to do extraordinary things in a time of crisis versus the government just deciding, right? So Taiwan has, again, a free press. They have a government that's very responsible to the people. They have just undergone a democratic election, right? Where despite the Chinese government's best attempts, the sort of left-wing DPP party retained power, right? President Tsai is still in power. She just was reelected. So their first case was on January 21st, right? So, right away, they didn't take the draconian approach of banning travel, right? Now we all know they had less travel from China than previously because of different political restrictions. But all they did is just really ramp up the screening after kind of early January when in the time when Wuhan was in the news in Taiwan, there was just like more and more intense screening going on of people coming in.
So you could argue that they started testing faster maybe than other countries decided to respond to something.
Well, I'm not sure about like the testing kits that we're arguing about now, but they were inspecting and screening travelers before January 15th. Okay. So they were already testing and screening people coming in. So that gives you an idea of how prepared what they were. After the 21st of January, major airlines started to suspend flights incoming from Wuhan. And then 3 weeks later, there was a ban on all flights except for 4 cities in China. Okay. So, there was some travel bans, but generally speaking, this was a process of screening and testing. What was also very interesting is the way the government has used kind of its powers of requisition, in a way to create huge amounts of equipment that doctors need. So Taiwan has created millions and millions and millions of masks, right? They've created all kinds of different equipment that other governments have been, for whatever reason, unwilling or unable to create. And
this has been, just to be clear, this has been done by the government itself, ramping up the production for things like masks.
Yes, but with in unison with the people. This is a democratic government, and the people are approving of this protocol. But just to get into the details of what they're doing, their preferred tactic has been home quarantine, right? So they have used some measures that include, like, there are penalties, there are fines for people who break isolation orders, right? But on the other hand, again, there hasn't been this like draconian kind of checkpoint lockdown that you see in China. I mean, organizers of mass events were encouraged to cancel. You had religious institutions suspend services. You had, schools closed, but only for a couple weeks. Classes resumed at the end of February. The production of masks was pretty amazing. I mean, they have millions of these things, 14 million actually. But basically, their containment strategy has been vindicated by many scientists, especially given that according to the data, about 58% of all cases in Taiwan have been from local transmission. So, they are way outnumbering imported infections, which is kind of a big deal. So look, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, China, they're all dealing with this in different ways. But I would argue that the way Taiwan has done it, just by the data, just by the tiny amount of cases, the fact that their society has been largely uninterrupted by this thing, and the fact that they have just one death, and the fact that there's less panic and more belief in the government, and that this government is a democratic one, really paints a picture of, I think, what we should all aspire to.
So outside of Taiwan, are there any other? I forget who was on your graph.
Yeah, I can show this again because some people are these are just some of the like kind of more popular countries people are discussing. South Korea.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Yeah, talk about South Korea and Singapore a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, Korea again, I would say is slightly less open than Taiwan. Korea still has a lot of rules and regulations left over from its authoritarian past, right? Which do help in times like these. But at the end of the day, it's a multi-party political democracy. President Moon is not going to get to run again. This is his one and only term. There's a relatively free press, and there's a lot of social media that exists without much censorship. So, the South Korean people know what's going on. Now, unfortunately, there is a religious organization in Korea which had chapters in Wuhan, right? So one of the believers of this group, some call it a cult, some call it a sect, you call it what you want. But basically in January, one of the believers, a 61-year-old woman, had come back from Wuhan, and she triggered a super spreader event inside of a congregation, inside of a church, essentially in South Korea near Daegu, where like 4,500 people were. So this is kind of where the bulk of the infections kind of started was from this event. And a very high percentage of people in this particular sect have been infected. But the South Korean government has responded in a way that puts, really, I mean, I'm in the Bay Area. It puts what we have here to shame. I mean, they've had for a long time drive-through test kits, which the government has set up, where you basically drive with your car and you roll down your window and you get tested and you wait, and then you get sorted or triaged accordingly. And the stuff is either covered by your insurance or available for a small fee. And they've just done a very competent job of doing this. Now, I know some people will say that, hey, South Korea and Taiwan have done really well, but look, they had SARS. They had opportunities to practice this. Well, I think all countries have had opportunities to practice this. China obviously had opportunities to deal with this in previous, avian flus, right? And they decided that their first action was going to be censorship. So that, again, this goes back to the sort of Chernobyl effect, right? If we think back to the 1980s and we look at what happened at Chernobyl, where Soviet officials were essentially decided to push the limits of this reactor beyond what was safe for the public for Communist Party goals. And you had a meltdown, and then you had a cover up by the government, and God knows how many people died. This idea of the Chernobyl effect is very strong, that essentially dictatorships put their own image above the public's, right? And that's why I think authoritarianism is really bad for public health. So you've got some really good examples with South Korea and Taiwan. And then you've got some bad examples. I mean, look, the United States is a democracy in structure. However, I would say that, our administration is exhibiting some of these signs that are somewhat authoritarian in nature, in terms of The president apparently, not wanting to include more numbers to make his image look worse. This was broken a couple weeks ago, a big story. The fact that CDC officials went to him in January and he decided he didn't want to kind of make this a big focus. So there were a lot of things that I think he did from a personally that may mirror, some of the paranoia and let's say authoritarian tendencies that you may see in these other countries. And that's been really awful for the American people. Let's put it that way. But I would say that generally speaking, the problem in the United States has been incompetence, not dictatorship. We all have Twitter. So I've been watching since January. I've seen this whole thing unfold. My inability to make a difference, is one thing, but it's not like I've been censored from seeing what's been going on. I mean, doctors are sharing information from Seattle and from all these different hospitals, and we're reading reports, and these things aren't being deleted off the internet. I mean, you got to think about the fact that in China, that's what happens. Like a doctor would make a post from Wuhan and it gets deleted by the internet police, right? So the internet police in China have been empowered in a huge way. So again, at the end of the day, any sort of authoritarian thinking or mindset is going to be bad, in my opinion, when it comes to dealing with these disasters that require flexibility, openness, communication, and innovation, right? And we should be very wary about governments telling us that they need to take our rights and liberties away to keep us safe. This is done with terrorism. This is done with any sort of threat to the population, right? During wartime. And it's done during times of pandemic, right? So we should be very careful about intrusions on our privacy. You've had lots of countries, including Israel, start to warrantlessly monitor citizens' phones and data to try and prevent the spread of the disease. China has done has had massive initiatives in this area, right? Where they're working with tech companies to essentially color code citizens according to how risky they are. They were doing a pretty staggering effort to track people who had left, who had left Wuhan and Hubei. It was pretty amazing. A lot of these people from Hubei, they basically said that they couldn't go anywhere, even if they hadn't even been in their hometown. So merely their phone showing that they lived in a particular region due to their national ID was enough to prevent them from gaining access to public transportation or going into certain buildings. So there was almost you could think of the idea of racism, but of people from a certain city that was happening in China based on this, and that they've kind of lost this idea of that one Chinese scientist said that there's no more boundary in terms of spatial privacy, informational privacy, decision-making privacy. So they say that the right of the people to control how their information is obtained and used is deeply linked to the experience of autonomy and freedom. Without the control of their own information and the private space in which they are protected from interference, how can people make important independent decisions? Right. So in China, people have had their decision-making powers independently taken away from them, which I think is not a good thing. And it's not something that we should let happen in the United States. It's not something that we should let happen in Europe. So I would encourage people to be careful and be wary of officials coming in and promising that they're going to only take away our rights for a temporary period of time.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. So you said we should not allow them to, as citizens of these governments that we're obviously part of. How do we do that? What does that look like?
Well, obviously, in a dictatorship, you have no options because there aren't elections or meaningful ways to push back. In democracies, we have many different ways of doing that. We may not be able to protest in the streets as much, obviously,
yes.
at the moment. However, we can use the power of the pen and continue to expose and force the government to act. I mean, obviously, I would hope that people are reading the news in the United States and have probably seen the fact that there have been probably two major factors in pushing the administration to be more serious. One is, of course, the historic economic crisis we're going through. But the other is the fact that like journalists have continued to expose scandals relating to novel coronavirus and how the administration has handled it. So write in your local paper. I mean, if we didn't have the local press, if we didn't have scientists publishing, if we didn't have people working on data publishing online, we wouldn't be able to cross compare and innovate and think about how things are happening in Seattle versus how they're happening in Southern California, right? So our ability to keep a free press and free expression is paramount in these times, in my opinion. The other thing that we have to keep an eye out for is our privacy. So currently there's acts that may try to get like squeezed in right now. There's one act called the Earn It Act, which has nothing to do with pandemics or health or viruses, but it's basically an act that politicians are debating in the Congress, which would make it easier for law enforcement to force companies to comply with their search and seizure laws based on this idea of like they need to stop child pornography, which of course is a serious thing. But any self-respecting privacy advocate, whether it's the ACLU or the EFF, will tell you that this is a disastrous law because it'll basically prevent, at the end of the day, if the law probably will not pass because citizens are active, they're activated, right? And attorneys are activated and journalists are activated, which is why we need to remain vigilant. But you got to be careful, and you got to see what the government's trying to do today, tomorrow, this week. You got to read these bills that they're discussing carefully. You got to call your representatives. You got to make your voice heard because you can, right? At least you have time to do that. There's not a whole lot that you can do right now, but you can pressure your elected representatives to make good decisions. We still have that right here. So this act would basically discourage tech companies from allowing encryption within their platforms, right? Because the government wants to see what's going on, right? So we need to fight that. That's an overreach. It's unnecessary. And these are things that are getting slipped in while we're distracted. So if you're in America, if you're in France, if you're in the United Kingdom, wherever you are, if you live in a democracy, use the rights that you have to make sure your rights and freedoms don't get eroded. Because whether it was after 9/11 with the Patriot Act, whether it was after the Olympics in 2008 in China, with the government in China basically promised a temporary increase in security measures. Yeah, that wasn't very temporary. That was permanent, right? So governments, time and time again, different kinds and shapes and sizes of governments come in and tell you that, hey, we're gonna like, we may need to infringe on what's going on a little bit, but like we'll give your rights back later. That's just not something that we should trust them with. So use the time you have if you're at home. Keep an eye out closely with regard to legislation in Washington if you're an American. Be careful what's being snuck into these bills, right? And you can get on the phone and talk to your legislators, representatives. You can talk to the press. A lot of folks on this call, I assume, are in the scientific community. I mean, scientists have played such a great role in the last few weeks and months in terms of helping the public understand the threat and publishing their thoughts online. Remember, China doesn't have that. Like, there is no Twitter, right? So let's use what we have and let's protect it. I mean, even despite the fact that we have this grossly incompetent government, I happen to believe that if the administration had been just slightly different, literally, had we had any of the previous 5 administrations in power right now, we would not be going through this right now. I don't think that the United States' incompetence is a symptom of our government as a whole. I think it's very much a symptom of the particular people in power right now, at least is what I would like to argue.
I want to talk a little bit more about data privacy, because that's been a topic really since yesterday, but heavily today, especially around as it relates to, the argument that the more data that we can aggregate on things that are going on, the better, especially if it means that, we can funnel some of that back to us, whether it's, predictive modeling or what have you. How do we find the balance between open sourcing all of our data and, still keeping our privacy?
Right. So I think that there is scientific data that can be harvested that is not connected to our IDs, right? So that's been a longstanding tradition in medicine. I know it gets violated often, but ideally, like when you get sucked into a data set, I don't want your name to be on that, right? I don't want your ID stack or your address to be on that. Yes, it can include demographics about you, but there's no reason for your entire name and ID and whereabouts to be uploaded to a national database, in my opinion. I think that very much the government should still follow a process of rule of law and basically due process. And okay, like what they're doing in South Korea or Taiwan, for instance. Guess what? Yeah, okay. So if you get tested and you test positive for novel coronavirus, okay. Well, guess what? Then you're going to get interviewed, right? And the government's going to try and figure out who you came into contact with. And those people are going to be contacted. And those people are going to be asked to come in for testing. None of this, in my opinion, really violates civil liberties. I mean, this is a reasonable response. And even now, like enforced social distancing for a few weeks is to me very reasonable. This is like what should be happening in our country. However, like long-term draconian measures and impositions on our privacy are not acceptable. So I think when it comes to data privacy, we have two fights to fight, two fronts, let's say, two fronts in the battle. One is making sure that the data that's being harvested by scientists is not attached to our name and address. And number two, that any data that is specific to us is done on a permissioned basis, that they ask us for that. And I think that's possible still to fight for in democracies. I obviously don't think that's possible in dictatorships. I mean, the government in China is just working with the tech companies to tag and sort and rate and score people. And, there's no accountability mechanism that the people have to push back on that.
All right, I'm going to grab a couple questions that have come in along the way. If you can see it down there, actually, if you click that Ask a Question button, Alex, you could even pick and choose some, but I'll start us with the top one, maybe while you open that up and see if there's any that are interesting. We have a lot of Europeans on here for sure. So you've talked about kind of Taiwan, South Korea, the US. What do we know what's going on in Europe?
Yeah, well, obviously, from what I've seen, at least, the UK has been compared most sort of to the US in terms of being sort of the most incompetent of the different European governments at the moment. I think that you're going to see probably a better response from countries like Germany, Switzerland, France, Belgium. I think that the infrastructure and the level of the quality and the level of free press and open innovation in countries like Spain and Italy and Greece is slightly lower if you just look at things like corruption indexes and things like that. And that really shows in times like this. The virus has a way of really like bringing to light a society's negative sides, basically. So I think that when it comes to Europe, again, be careful, protect your rights. Don't let your rights get taken away from you in an unnecessary way. I think there's a reasonable compromise here. I think that we can be very pro testing. We can be pro social distancing. These things don't take away our rights. So I think that a lot of the continental Europe has done as good as it has been able to do. If you look at what happened in Italy, I mean, a lot of it was that the government just didn't really act fast enough, right? If you looked at the curve of cases, if they had just acted a couple days earlier, it would be a lot better, right? So just about having a plan and taking this seriously. Again, a lot of the ways that you can defeat this thing have nothing to do with you taking my privacy and freedoms away from me. They're just having a government that is like has a game plan, right? So look, I think what Angela Merkel did was responsible, telling the people the truth, about what could happen. I think that's a helpful thing for a democracy to do. You obviously won't see that happening in China, right? So I think being truthful with the population, encouraging or enforcing social distancing, testing the hell out of the population, these are things that you're going to see in Europe. And I don't think any of them are incompatible with human rights or freedom.
Fair enough. Do you want to pick out the next one you want, or you want me to keep grabbing some of these?
Yeah. Let's see. I mean, you've got. I mean, look, one area that I would like to hit on is just we are talking about a breakdown in health infrastructure in high-income democracies like Italy and the United States, right? So if you look at Seattle, you look at northern Italy, there's they're on the road to Wuhan. It's really quite bad. Now think about countries that don't have that infrastructure, right? So what I think we need to be concerned about is like Venezuela, which now has a bunch of cases. Latin America is starting to get cases. There are millions of Venezuelan refugees living in Brazil and Colombia with very little rights, with very little infrastructure, with barely any housing, with no resources. I would hope that our humanitarian organizations are paying attention to that and seeing what they can do. I mean, I would imagine that once we do have a surplus of testing kits, I hope and believe that is going to be the case in Europe and the United States in the next 2 weeks. There's no reason why it can't, from what I've seen. So if we have a surplus of testing kits eventually, those have to be donated to some of these other countries. I mean, if you look at what's happening in Syria, they're due to the very close nature of the Iranian dictatorship and the Syrian dictatorship, there were reports as far back as a month ago of Iranian militant, soldiers in Syria being sick and dying and actually evacuating. So there could be, and again, we don't know because there's no free press in Syria, but I would say I would be very concerned for the millions of Syrian refugees as well. I would be very concerned for the millions of people in North Korea who don't have a working health system. The only people in North Korea who have access to anything that resembles a working health system are the party members and the people who live in the cities. But outside of that, it's like District 12 and the Hunger Games, and people have nothing. And if you actually look at there's outbreaks in China, there's outbreak in South Korea. What do you think's in the middle? I think that if there's any way for us to get testing kits in there, maybe even smuggle them in through the Chinese border, I think we need to start getting creative. But I'd be very worried about the societies that don't even have the same structure. Again, societies that are very wealthy and rich are failing, right, because of incompetence. So all we need to kind of do is look at that Iran example. There are a lot of countries like Iran, right, that are both very incompetent and very closed. And those are the ones I'd worry about the most, right? You may see even regimes fall in the next 6 months because of just absolute inability to contain this thing. So that's something that's not going to be talked about enough, is what's happening inside these dictatorships. It's something the Human Rights Foundation just deals with. Generally speaking, there's very little news about what's happening in dictatorships compared to democracies, generally speaking, because you can't be a journalist without getting arrested. And there's 4 billion people who live under authoritarian regimes in 93 countries right now. So I would be very concerned about what's happening with them. I mean, even Russia, there's not a lot of English language reporting about what's going on in Russia, but Russia, before about 4 to 5 days ago, the word on the street was that they were like totally fine. They had basically no cases. That has changed very quickly. If you have just looked at the news in the last 2 days, there's the country's starting to be locked down. They're closing borders. There's cases popping up. Again, there isn't a robust free press there, so we just don't really know what's going on. But it does look like there's going to be a big spread. And I would imagine that the Russian response is going to be much more similar to the Iranian response than even the Chinese.
A couple of the questions that I saw in the Q&A portion talked about outside of obviously not having free press. Could you argue that authoritarian regimes are better suited to respond because they can just dictate what needs to happen right away, which is helpful for something like quarantine?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's obviously the argument for authoritarianism, is they can move fast and break things, right? They don't have to abide by the rights of the people. They don't have to listen to the people. They can just kind of do what they want. So in the case of Singapore, sure, it works because it's a relatively meritocratic autocracy. They're very competent, right? They're the most competent dictatorship in the world. Most dictatorships aren't anywhere close to as competent as Singapore. So the Singaporeans have done quite well so far. But at the end of the day, that's a rare case. most dictatorships are much more like Iran than they are like Singapore. If you just look at the numbers, if you just pick 10 out of a hat and look at like Laos and, Burundi and Zimbabwe and Cuba and Belarus and North Korea, if you just think about a bunch of dictatorships, they're functioning much more like Iran than they are like Singapore. And they're going to be very susceptible to this because, again, in dictatorships, the government does not operate with the view of how can we help the people. The government takes the view of how can we help ourselves, right? So the police in dictatorships don't work for the people; they work for the dictator. It's a big, big difference. The police in democracies work for the people. This is a huge, huge difference. So I think that obviously, yeah, dictatorships can move fast, but I don't see any reason why democracies can't move just as fast. Again, just look at Taiwan and South Korea, compare them to China. Even the very best things China has done have been outperformed by the data by South Korea and Taiwan in terms of per capita, how this virus has been addressed. So, I mean, can a dictatorship, fight this thing? Yes, but not as effectively as a democracy, from what I've seen.
All right, see if I can grab us another one. Lots of people are asking about their specific region for sure. I don't think we have time to go through each one of those. Here's an interesting one. When it comes to openness and competency, what role do you think education plays?
It's a hugely important, and this goes back to the idea of free expression and in media. A lot of the reason why that first 2 months went so poorly in China was because people were being censored from understanding about the virus. So, scientists were isolating the virus, processing it, trying to understand it. They were sequencing it at the end of December. But none of this was allowed to see the light of day, and the evidence was literally destroyed. And the doctors who uncovered it were disappeared or they're dead now. So we need to really rely on that idea of free flow of information. It's absolutely essential in times of public health crisis. And the education piece is huge. I think that, to be honest, Twitter has been a remarkable sort. I mean, people make fun of Twitter a lot for different things, but for me, Twitter has been an absolutely essential source of information. I mean, I seriously and I'm borrowing this from someone else, but I would look at, when you go on Instagram, it's kind of like people are like, what virus, right? On Facebook, they're like, well, I don't know. It's not that big of a deal. And on Twitter, people are like really freaking out. And they really understand it. And I think this is really kind of accurate in terms of information source. If you get your news from Instagram, you're not going to know what's going on. If you get your news from Facebook, there's going to be a lot of denialists, right? But Twitter is packed with experts and people who are contrarians and people who really saw this thing. Plus, it's just very global. It's not restricted to your friend circle. So I do a lot of China watching because I'm a human rights activist. So I have a lot of friends who are journalists who are covering China or who are human rights activists who have fled China and are still working on it. So I saw this thing pop up in early January, in mid-January in Wuhan, and I was like, wow, we have to pay attention to this. And it was just staggering to me to see Americans ignore this thing throughout the entire month of February, essentially, especially our government and the mainstream media. And obviously, until even these days, the vast majority of people are in denial. It's really incredible. And I think it's because of a lack of education, a lack of information, right? So I think social media has become really important in that regard. You have to be able to sense make, right? You have to be able to figure out what's true and what's not. And that's a process that you can go through by double checking before you decide to share something. So if you get an email from someone and there's no sources, why don't you not share that? Why don't you actually dig out where that thing came from? Someone sends you a Medium post. Great. Why don't you actually check the sources on that? But in Twitter, it's relatively easy to see, if you follow top journalists from the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, they're probably not going to tweet disinformation, right? And if they do tweet it, they'll get fired, right? There are actual consequences. For some random egghead on Twitter, yeah, don't listen. You have to take what they say with a grain of salt. So you need to start shaping your ability to sense make in this time in a big way. And children need to do that too. So I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the education for kids starts to get devoted to how to tell facts from not facts, right, in the coming years. And this will be increasingly important for stuff like this.
Yeah, for sure. I think some people, so we've got a bunch of questions that are still in there. And my guess is that you're a guy that's pretty active on Twitter. Would you like people to come and engage with you on Twitter?
Yeah. I'm, I can just type it here, right?
Yeah.
My handle is Gladstein.
Lucky you.
Yeah. Come and talk to me. I also, there's a couple people who like you should follow on this, who've been right from the beginning, who were mocked at the beginning for saying this thing was serious, and they were made fun of. So one of them is this guy Ben Hunt. So he runs. I'll just write his name. Ben Hunt from Epsilon Theory is someone who's been really just on the money on this the whole time and is worth following. Another guy is a guy named Balaji Srinivasan, who is I'll give you his handle here. He's an entrepreneur and a scientist from Silicon Valley, and he's someone who's definitely worth following. This guy's been on the money the whole time. Again, it was mocked by even journalists. He got into a thing with Kara Swisher from Recode in February, and they published a story making fun of Silicon Valley VCs for saying don't handshake, okay? And he was like, "Are you kidding me?" And they were like, they didn't get it, right? And then also follow what's going on in China, right? So look, he may be kicked out today, but I would say Paul Moser has been an incredible person to follow on this. He's the New York Times technology correspondent in Beijing, and he's just like always showing videos of like what's going on. And like back in February, he was showing stuff that Americans should have been paying attention to. Like, hi, I'm on lockdown in my city, and I have to order food, and I get to see on my app the temperature of the person delivering the food to me. Like, this was happening a month ago in China, right? So someone should have been able to look at that and been like, oh, wow, this disease is starting to spread around the world. That's probably going to happen to me in 6 weeks. Maybe I should prepare accordingly, right? So, just use these information avenues that we have. They're very, very useful. And I would say don't discount anything that sounds surprising, but definitely verify it, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great advice. Is the short answer to everything is like fact check. Take the extra time to go and look up, where it came from, who's talking about it.
Nothing is too crazy. If you look at just looking at the homepage of the Bloomberg website today is literally out of a book. White House wants to send individuals $1,000 stimulus checks. Trump's Chinese virus tweet adds fuel to fire with Beijing. $850 billion stimulus package. Amazon prioritizing essential products. India could be next virus hotspot. Like, New York virus won't peak for 45 more days. You're looking at this thing and you feel like it's out of a movie. So nothing is too crazy. So be open-minded, but verify, very important.
Yeah, appreciate that. All right, Alex, we got to wrap up, but thank you for being here today. Any parting thoughts you want to share with the group?
Yeah. Don't let them take your privacy and rights away from you. It's not necessary. You don't need a police state to fight the virus. See you guys.
There you go. Thanks for being here, Alex.
Mm-hmm.
And for the rest of the crew, Alex's handle is in there. If you've got more questions or just want to have a discussion and dialogue, go and look him up. I think this is also a good time to remind everybody, if you missed Ellie's session that closed us out yesterday, go and watch that one. She has some really helpful advice about what to do when you're reading the news and you feel really triggered. She described it as kind of feeling like you're, starting to really scrunch up or get tense. Maybe your stomach tightens, or you feel your chest tighten, or your breathing increase. It's just a great time before you react to it right away. Take a second, put your feet on the ground, take in a couple deep breaths and exhale, really fill up your belly and give your body a chance to stop responding to it with your stereotypical fear responses. So it's just a great way to kind of short circuit your brain and insert that pause. I know it's so easy right now to see something and feel triggered and you want to go and send it out or share it, but take that extra time, as Alex recommended as well, Go and look up the facts. And one thing that we try to do as best as we could, unfortunately, well, thankfully, Alex was here today. But usually what we try to do is get a couple different perspectives when it's topics like these to really dig in and debate different perspectives. But always go and take the extra time to surround yourself with information that you trust, because there is a lot of stuff coming out right now, and it's in all of our best interest to help each other fact check things so we've got the most up-to-date and accurate information. And then if it changes, and we can go back and share that with one another as well. All right, we are getting into the closing half of our day today. We're going to be hearing from James Ehrlich on the future state of living in self-reliant neighborhoods. He's doing some really interesting stuff at Stanford there. Jamie Metzel is going to be coming to us talking about genetics and different technologies that exist that could protect us in the future and maybe even help us now. Bradley Twinham will be finally talking about AI, I think a little bit more in depth. People are always interested in that. And then we'll end the day with Lisa Andrews talking about how can we take some of these positives and negatives and really put them into action. I'm going to check the chat one last time and see if the SU team, if you haven't already, maybe you have. You have, of course you have. We've got the resource document. We're going to be putting in links as fast as we can get them in there. And of course, join the Facebook group, contribute. I'm sure you got a lot of good ideas coming out of this session that could be great fodder on Be Innovative. So please take a second and go poke over there. We'll have a couple minutes between now and the next session. I will see you shortly.